you haven't already guessed, that's me. Welcome to today's event. As Cindy said, events like this are really special, and particularly special to us because as a hospital, when I joined in 2013, I joined with a specific purpose, which was that we were going to improve the quality and safety of Doncaster and Bassetlaw teaching hospitals. That was my brief when I first joined the trust, when I first met Mike, the chief executive at the time, and the chairman. They were really clear with me that my responsibilities were to start to work and improve nurse and midwifery and allied health professional staffing levels, introduce a framework for some standards that we would build upon, and begin a journey to be as safe a trust as we could be. And the reality is that journey continues, and I know over the last few years people have perceived that the focus has been more about money and performance than it has about quality. That was never my view, and I know that in the audience we've got Sarah Singh, Medical Director, and Moira Hardy, Director of Nursing, Midwifery and Allied Health Professionals, and we share that same view that the actual priority for us as an organisation is the quality of the services that we provide. And if we get them right, then we'll be an efficient and effective organisation. Now, sometimes people need to hear that sort of message from the very most senior people in the organisation to actually believe it. So hopefully by you listening to me today and listening to that message, you'll be able to get out there and make sure that every member of staff understands that journey that we're on and how they can actually contribute to that journey. In terms of that, we refresh the way in which we want to work in the next 3 years, and you'll see in the slide that some core principles in there about the values of the organisation, fundamentally what we're driving to do, and we're going to use them this year through the appraisal season to make sure that every member of staff knows how they can contribute to what our ambition is. And our ambition is to be the safest trust in England, outstanding in all that we do, and that is a genuine ambition. Clearly it's a tough ambition, but if we strive to get there and fall slightly short, we'll still be a lot safer than we are today as we sit in this auditorium about to have what I think will be an absolutely fantastic day. So thank you very much for coming, and obviously really do hope that you have a great day, you participate, and you get a lot of shared learning out of today's event. My actual real reason for being here is to introduce James, and although it might look like I'm actually playing on Candy Crush or doing my emails, it's actually I've got some notes just to make sure I don't forget anything. And at my time of life, if I don't have notes and I can't read them, then there's a real danger that I'll forget them. So I'm now going to introduce James Titcombe, who many in the audience will know, and James will go through the story. James currently works for a charity, Baby Lifelines, but he's previously held posts as National Advisor on Patient Safety and Culture and Quality for the Care Quality Commission. And James, by nature of his experience in his early career, works as a project manager in Sellafield, but more recently and more tragically in terms of the start of this journey, James was involved through his baby son Joshua, who was born at University Hospitals in Morecambe, with a series of events where unfortunately Joshua passed away about 9 days after birth at Furness General Hospital in November 2008. But James refused to explain the initial explanations that he and his wife were given about Joshua's death, and made an official complaint about his treatment. But it took about 17 months to actually get an apology from the organisation. And in March of 2001, the police launched an investigation into Joshua's death. It later concluded that Joshua's death was also related to incidents and issues that may have occurred in 18 other babies and 2 mothers. And subsequently, through James's effort and the efforts of his wife and others, there was an independent investigation by Dr. Bill Kirkland into the maternity unit, which was described at that time as seriously dysfunctional. And the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman also undertook investigations into the issues that James had uncovered by dogged hard work and effort, I think, in trying to get to the facts in terms of Joshua's care and treatment. As a result of that, James was awarded an OBE in the Queen's Birthday Honours List in 2015 for services to patient safety. And his talk today, I think, will fundamentally about patient safety and the lessons he's learned as a result of that. and should set the scene for that journey that we've talked about in terms of things do happen in the NHS. There are mistakes. The really important thing is how we deal with those mistakes, that we're open, we're honest, we're transparent, and where lessons are to be learned, we learn them to make sure that as we move forward, we're safer tomorrow than we were today. So on that note, I'll welcome James to the stage. I know it will be a great talk, and welcome him in the normal way, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. Richard's told you most of the story there anyway, so no, really nice to be here. Really been well looked after, and it looks like a fantastic day, so thank you for inviting me here. So I've got about an hour. I'll try and kind of limit that to about 50 minutes, and I'm going to tell you, can everybody hear me? The first part of this presentation is quite a sad story, and often there's a few tears, but after that it does get more positive, and I hope that the kind of themes of the presentation will really resonate with what you're talking about today. So to start the presentation then, this is a picture of me and my family back in 2008, and we're on holiday in Normandy in France. And obviously, I've lost a bit of weight since then, and got into shape. But basically, we're a happy family. That in the middle, believe it or not, is my daughter. She's 3.5 years old there. She's now 14, which, if you're a dad, you just can't comprehend how that could happen, but it's happened. And that's my wife, Hua, and as you can see, she's pregnant in that photo, and she's a couple of months pregnant. And we know it's going to be a baby, we know it's going to be a baby boy, we know it's going to be called Joshua, and we're really looking forward to Christmas that year, knowing that we'll have another member of the family in the household. So that pregnancy all went normal, it all went well. My wife's doing all the things that mums do, eating organic food and being healthy, and going to all the checkups, and totally normal pregnancy. Everything went well. And this kind of carried on until about 3 weeks before we were expecting Joshua. And that week, I remember having kind of a headache and a sore throat, feeling really poorly. And my daughter was sent home from nursery with some kind of a bug. So generally, the whole family's not feeling very well. And I remember getting home that weekend after work and thinking, thank goodness it's the weekend, you know. And then on the Saturday night, I remember about 9 o'clock, my wife, this is about three weeks before Joshua was due, my wife shouts to me from the bathroom, said, James, I think my waters broke. So, strong-minded, independent, calm man, pick up the phone to my mum in sheer panic. What do I do? And my mum says, don't worry, go to the hospital, tell them that you've been feeling poorly, tell them everything, and you'll be fine. And at that time, I'm thinking we'll be in safe hands, nothing to think that there was anything at all risky with what we were doing. So I drove my wife to the hospital, they checked her out, waters had broke. Quite surprised by the advice, and we talked about feeling poorly, and we were told that there's a lot of viruses going around, not to worry. She's looked after well, but told to go home, which I do remember thinking that's a bit strange because the water broke. The next day we went back, another checkup, again told everything's fine, went home again. So this is, the hours and hours are ticking by. And then the Monday morning, about 5 o'clock in the morning, my wife starts to get heavy contractions, and I take my wife to hospital, and got there at 6 o'clock, and at exactly 7:38, never forget the time, this happened. Joshua was born. Okay? And that's a photo of Joshua, probably about 20 minutes after he was born, and I just remember thinking, all my worries, panic over, perfect baby boy. I'm taking photos and sending them to everybody. Nothing wrong with him, seemed like a perfect healthy baby boy. About 30 minutes after that photo was taken, things started to go wrong, but it wasn't Joshua, it was actually my wife, and I remember her saying to me, James, I feel really cold, can you put your coat over me? So I put my coat over her. And then she went downhill really quickly and collapsed. And I called for help, and she had a very high temperature, she was really burning, and she was given fluids and antibiotics. It took about 20 minutes, but eventually the right people came, gave my wife fluids and antibiotics. And over the next couple of hours, my wife starts to recover. And it's during this time that I start to ask about Joshua. You know, if my wife needs antibiotics and fluids, what about Joshua? And the midwives that were looking after Joshua told me absolutely unequivocally, Joshua is fine, it's your wife you need, you know, we're focusing on your wife. And one of my big regrets to this day is that I kind of accepted that advice. I was, you know, knew that I was an anxious dad. My thinking was, these people see babies all the time, if they're not worried, I should be. And I was reassuring my wife, you know. Actually, we now know, and it's this word hindsight, with hindsight, Joshua desperately at that point needed to see a paediatrician. And we now know, had he seen a paediatrician at that point, he would have been given antibiotics, the same antibiotics that he needed, and the outcome for him would have been different. We know that now. But this is actually what happened. So over the next 24 hours, my wife collapsed. Joshua had a repeated low temperature, so he kept being put in and out of some form of heated cot. And I remember thinking, well, if he's got a low temperature, I can relax, because if he had an infection, he'd have a high temperature. That's how naive really I was. But of course, I now know that a low temperature in a neonate, or an inability for a baby to maintain a steady temperature, is a classic sign of infection, and that's what Joshua had. And all these signs, we now know, are clear signs of infection. He was breathing rapidly, he was mucousy, didn't want to feed. At one point, actually, about 2 o'clock in the morning, my wife called the bell by a bed because Joshua was grunting so much, and he was taken out of the room for about half an hour, and the midwife just brought him back and put him back in a heated cot again, so no paediatrician was called. And this carried on until, very tragically, 24 hours of age, so this is about 8 o'clock the next morning, my wife finds Joshua in the cot, blue, bubbling around his mouth, not breathing. He's then rushed into the special care baby unit. I'm at home at this point, thinking, getting the car seat ready, thinking I'm about to go and bring my new baby boy and my wife home, and I get a phone call from the hospital saying, come down, Joshua's struggling with his breathing, your wife's very upset. And I remember going down to the hospital, my wife's in tears, Joshua is in the special care baby unit, he's breathing with his own lungs, he's just got little tubes of oxygen in his nose, and I'm told to leave the room while they put him on full ventilation. So after that, we were told he's a very poorly baby, we were told various kind of differential diagnoses, so he might have a heart problem, he might have a problem with his esophagus, and they called a team from Manchester to come because they needed to transfer Joshua to a specialist centre in Manchester. And it was the conversation I had really with the nurse from Manchester, from the transfer team, that really made me worry. So one of the first conversations was I told this nurse about Joshua having a low temperature, and for the first time he said to me, well, that's a classic sign of sepsis. And from that moment, I think that something terrible has gone wrong with Joshua's care at Furness General Hospital. But I remember thinking to myself, that's for later. At the moment, we've got to concentrate on getting Joshua home. We were told by the Manchester team that his oxygen levels had been so low that there was a chance he could die, and if he didn't die, there was a high chance that he would have serious brain damage. So that was the reality from 24 hours earlier, we're going to take a baby boy home, to this very different reality. So he was transferred to Manchester. A consultant came out in the middle of the night. He was on the maximum conventional ventilation, life support that he could be given. And we were told, look, this is putting a lot of pressure on his heart and lungs. And this is when we were first told about another option for Joshua, which was ECMO. ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. So I understood that as being basically a heart and lung machine for babies. And we were told this would be a really good option for Joshua. His lungs were very infected. This would allow his lungs to rest while the treatment worked, while the antibiotics worked, and then he could be weaned back so his own lungs were working. This was a really good option. We were told about risks, so we were told because ECMO involves taking the blood out of the body, you needed a drug to thin the blood, and that increased the risk of bleeding. And in the end, I asked the consultant, look, what would you do if this was your son? And the consultant said to me, ECMO every time, and that was the moment I kind of decided ECMO. So he was transferred to the Freeman Hospital in Newcastle. I'll just briefly go to the next slide because this is the sad bit of the presentation. I promise it gets a little bit more light-hearted, but this is the sad bit. So he was born on the 27th of October, collapsed at 24 hours of age. That's a photo of Joshua with Emily when we're thinking there's nothing wrong. That's a photo of Joshua at the Freeman Hospital in Newcastle, where he spent several days. Conscious, sedated, able to open his eyes, able to squeeze your finger, you could change his nappy. And we're told at this point in Newcastle that 90% will get to take Joshua home, but his prognosis was very good. What actually happened was, I apologise, this is a really difficult bit of the presentation for me, they thought he was doing so well, on the 3rd of November they tried to wean him off the ECMO machine. During that process they hadn't realised that his left lung was more damaged than anybody realised. And while they tried to wean him off the ECMO machine, his left lung started to bleed. Basically that bleeding became more and more severe and catastrophic. And on the 5th of November, the consultant says, we're really sorry, we're going to have to turn Joshua's ECMO machine off, and Joshua died on the 5th of November. So you can imagine our world completely turned upside down. So, at the time, I worked in the kind of nuclear industry, very safety critical industry. My expectation was that no stone would be left unturned really into understanding what had happened, what had gone wrong with Joshua's care. The first thing that happened was the coroner in Newcastle said that this was a natural cause of death and that there couldn't be an inquest. Not that there couldn't be an inquest. And we were told, if you have concerns about Joshua's care at Barrow, at Furness General Hospital, make a complaint to the trust. So that's what we did. We didn't really see it as a complaint. We saw it as kind of writing down a chronology of what had happened to Joshua and asking some questions that we thought needed to be answered. And this triggered the trust to do an investigation. And one of the things we were advised was ask the trust for copies of Joshua's medical records. So we did. We wrote to the trust and said, can we have all copies of Joshua's medical records? And about a month later, just as I was about to collect his records, I got a phone call from the trust, and a lady said to me, we're really sorry, James, we have to tell you we've lost some of Joshua's medical records. And I said, what have you lost? And he said, well, we've lost the bright yellow observation chart. Joshua was put on observations, from enhanced observations from when he was born to when he was collapsed, so for a 24-hour period. And those records have gone missing. And actually, to this day, it's still a fact that there are no medical records, no notes of any of Joshua's observations or temperatures from the time he was born to the time he collapsed. And that's relevant a bit later. We were also told that Joshua's care, the failings were a one-off and nothing like it had happened in the unit before. Actually, we now know there were a whole series of very similar events at that unit. One of the things that happened actually was the Strategic Health Authority at the time put some pressure on the trust and said, look, you need to provide some assurance that your unit's safe. So the Chief Executive commissioned somebody called Dave Pauline Fielding to do an investigation, a review. That review kind of landed on the Chief Executive's desk just over a year later. And it was really serious. It had serious criticisms. It talked about poor relationships between staff, lack of clinical governance, but very, very serious issues. And just at that time, the trust was going through a foundation trust application and registering for the Care Quality Commission. And actually the Chief Executive didn't share that report with anybody. He kept it literally in his drawer. His board didn't see it. None of the regulators saw that report. It was effectively buried. And the trust did go on to get foundation trust status. Now, there were various investigations, and a little bit later in the presentation I'll talk to you through the number of different investigations that have happened since Joshua's death. But just to kind of jump forward in time, so Joshua's died in November 2008. This is the headline in the Health Service Journal, and the date there is February 2012. So the headline is, Mothers and Babies Still at Significant Risk at Morecambe Bay. I'll just tell you how this headline came about. So after Joshua's death, the Trust did various investigations that we weren't happy with. So there wasn't an inquest. We wrote to the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman, who at the time were the only organisation you could go to. They took a year, and then they wrote back to me and said, because records have gone missing, because they thought the Trust had already done the right things in response to Joshua's death, the language they used was it wouldn't have a worthwhile outcome in their investigation. So the Ombudsman refused to investigate. At that point, the Chief Executive wrote to me and said, we're not going to engage with you anymore, we're not going to answer any more questions about Joshua's care. I now know actually I was treated as what's called a vexatious complainant. That's how the trust treated me at the time. So at that point, I went back to the coroner in Newcastle, and it took, I think, 17 letters, but I eventually persuaded the coroner in Newcastle to open an inquest, and that inquest took place more than 2 years after Joshua died, in the middle of 2011. And actually the findings of that inquest, it ruled that Joshua had died preventably. There were many serious failures in care. It made some observations that the trust weren't being honest about what happened. And that investigation triggered lots of things, and the Care Quality Commission were there, and Monitor were there, and they carried out, after that investigation, a review of the maternity unit at Furness General Hospital. And that review found, I think, 119 significant risks to mothers and babies that the hospital hadn't addressed, they weren't aware of and hadn't addressed. And that triggered basically this headline. By this time I'd met a number of other families, just through chance really, who seemed to have very similar stories to tell. They'd lost children in very similar circumstances. And we got together at this point and said, look, how can it be that these risks are ongoing in that unit when our babies died all those years earlier? What's gone wrong? And we were very lucky because we met the Secretary of State for Health, the local MP was supportive, and he agreed to have an independent investigation. And that investigation became the Kirkland Report, so the Morecambe investigation, chaired by Bill Kirkup. And that published in March 2015. Big report, really recommend if you have the time to read the full report. But for me, we're going to kind of take one paragraph that's the most important, that kind of sums up this investigation. It's probably this one. So, errors occur in every healthcare system, but what's inexcusable is a repeated failure to examine those events properly, to be open and honest with those who suffered, and to learn to prevent reoccurrence. Yet he said this is what happened consistently over the whole period, 2004 to 2012. And that 2004 date's really important. There's a reason why that date is 2004. And right at the end of my presentation, I'll tell you a little story about that date, that 2004 date. So just a little side story, really, to kind of bring out some of the themes. CQC didn't get this right. So CQC, the Care Quality Commission, their role at the time obviously was to make judgments about the quality of care in hospitals. This is the basic sequence of events. So after Joshua's death, CQC went into the trust, they did an assessment of the maternity unit, and they gave it a green bill of health, the all clear. That led to the trust getting a foundation trust status. Yet in September 2011, we've got these serious problems. So think about that. What actually happened? Was the trust okay? Was the unit safe? And did it suddenly go downhill? Or did the CQC miss the problems? And it's pretty obvious what happened. And myself and actually a whistleblower from CQC who would raise concerns in the media that CQC's approach wasn't fit for purpose, petitioned for an investigation, and CQC commissioned the investigation. And that became what's known as the Thornton Report. Now I remember this really clearly because in the middle of 2000, when this was published, in the middle of, I think it was 2013, it was in the news headlines for about 7 days, and I had like kind of Sky TV vans parked outside the house. It really was an intense time. And the reason it was intense, these were the kind of headlines that it generated. So, hospital watchdog in chaos, NHS cover-up goes on, 3 years of shame. These are not good headlines, are they? If you're the CQC, you wouldn't be happy. A watchdog beset by scandals. And really, the point I'm going to make with this is it wasn't the fact that CQC had got their inspection model wrong that led to these bad headlines. They missed problems in the maternity unit. They had a generalist approach to inspection, so the same inspector that was responsible for inspecting a GP unit or a care home was also the same inspector who had to go in and make quite complex, nuanced judgments about maternity. It's just a flawed model, it wasn't going to work. And that's what the Thornton Report found. But that wasn't what generated these headlines. What generated the headlines was a quote in the report where CQC had actually done their own internal review that found many of these problems and weaknesses in their approach. And somebody's quoted as remembering that the chief executive said, read my lips, this must never see the light of day, this report. And that was in the report. So it was the cover-up that became the headline, not the fact that CQC made mistakes. And that's a real theme, I think, for some reason in healthcare and regulation. It's often the attempts to kind of hide what happened that lead to more reputational damage than what actually happened itself. So, moving on to a little bit more positive. Since I do this presentation a lot, and people say to me, how can you keep telling the story? And the answer is, if the story had no happy ending and nothing positive, I wouldn't be able to do it. But so much has happened, so much has changed since Joshua's death. So one of the things that I'm really pleased has changed is at Morecambe Bay, the local legal trust. So in 2015, this is what the Kirkland Report said. So it talked about the response from the trust being flawed and inadequate, characterised by denial and cover-up. Okay? So this is a unit that doesn't have a good culture. But since then, actually, the head of midwifery at the time was Sasha Wells, and the chief executive of the trust have done amazing things. And they've actually, while this was going on, I had a lot of hostility from the local population because they viewed some of the families that were raising these concerns, comments like they're just, families that are just wanting to close the unit, and they want to, and that couldn't have been further from the truth. And actually, the legacy is that there is now a big £13 million brand new maternity unit, and I've been shown around this maternity unit, and here are some of the photos. So it's called the South Lakes Birthing Centre. Absolutely fantastic building, all state-of-the-art. And one of the things I really like is they now have a simulation suite. And there was a bit of an argument, why should a little local hospital like Furness General have all this equipment? Shouldn't that be one of the big hospitals in Manchester? And I think the trust won that argument. Why can't the big hospitals come and train here? Why do we have to go there? So that doll there, that robot is called Simmo. And when I think about Joshua's care, the poor relationships between midwives, not speaking to, Bill Kirkland does a talk, and he said, that the relationships were so poor that the only thing the obstetricians and the midwives agreed on was that they both really didn't like the paediatricians. So that gives you an indication of the dysfunctional teamwork. And now this is great because midwives, paediatricians, obstetricians simulate things going wrong. They work as a team, they debrief. Before things go wrong, they're already used to working very closely together. So fantastic legacy of improvement at Morecambe Bay. And it's not just me saying that. If you read the CQC inspections, they're now recognised as being good in their maternity services. Let's take a drink of water. So that's kind of the building and the equipment. But for me, what they did, you can imagine after the Morecambe Bay investigation, I'm not in a good place with this trust. I'm thinking this is a trust that's covered up. It's how can I trust them? And I persuaded the trust to do a bit of work. And this work was carried out at the end of 2016. And what I said to them was, look, I've had all these investigations that say you didn't investigate my son's death properly. Lots of information about that. Nobody has actually given me a proper investigation into what happened to Joshua. And there was a bit of resistance to this because it was, why would that be useful now, 8 years after Joshua died? And I argued and I said, well, you don't know what you don't know. There might be lessons from it, and we need to know for our own sanity that this has been done. So the trust did this investigation really carefully. They've got a team from Manchester to do it, and I'll talk about what the investigation found in a moment. And one of the things that happened along the way was, by this time, the NMC had carried out some processes, and one midwife had been struck off and another midwife had been suspended for 9 months. And the particular midwife who was suspended, and I won't mention the name, but she won't mind me talking about this, the trust had a bit of a dilemma, I think, because suspended for 9 months, the board are telling the chief exec, you've got to sack this midwife. And I had a conversation with the chief executive, and the chief executive, would you be prepared to meet this member of staff? At the time, my feeling was that this was somebody who had lied about what happened, basically, had not been open and honest. I never blamed this individual for Joshua's death. I know that there were mistakes made, but it was never a question of, you've caused Joshua's death. I knew that wasn't the case. But I wanted to meet this midwife and have this conversation and to understand this. So I'm going to this meeting thinking this is somebody I'm quite angry with who hasn't taken any responsibility for what happened to Joshua. And I sat down in the room, and the first thing I said to the midwife was, look, I want you to know that I don't blame you for my son's death. And I was about to go on to say, but I think you've not been very honest. I didn't get the chance because she burst into tears at that point, and she said to me, Well, I blame myself, and I've blamed myself every single day since this happened. It's been, you know, I will never forget what happened to Joshua. There are so many things I wish I'd done differently. And that moment completely changed my whole feeling towards that person. Far from being somebody who didn't care, she was somebody that actually took a huge amount of weight and responsibility. And I wondered why was it that I couldn't have had that conversation with her 8 years ago? And I realised it wasn't her, it was the trust, it was the environment, it was the managers. And you know, I to this day believe that the staff involved in Joshua's care all would have wanted to be open and honest with me, and it was the fear, it was the worry, it was the culture of blame that didn't allow them to do that. And so that was a really kind of profound moment. I think there's some things happening nationally. I hope that we'll make sure that kind of situation doesn't happen in the future. So 2016, this trust that was characterised by denial and dishonesty published this fresh investigation into my son's death on the website. And this is basically what it said. It found many problems, things that we didn't know about already. Joshua's death was avoidable, many serious problems, problems with Hwa's care that we didn't know about before. And the trust basically said at this point, you know, there are 18 recommendations. That this report was done in a way as if Joshua had died recently. So the 18 recommendations were what the investigation team would have made if Joshua had died last week. And when the trust looked at all those 18 recommendations, they said, look, all of these have now been made. But when they audited when those changes were made, when those recommendations were implemented, most of them weren't until 2012 or 2013. So that's 5 years after Joshua's death, that had they done a good investigation at the time, they could have made those changes, and they didn't. And the tragedy, of course, is that if you read the Kirkland Report, after Joshua died, 6 other babies died for preventable reasons, similar related reasons. And I believe, you know, that was a missed opportunity, and that if Joshua's death had been investigated properly, that could have been avoided. So, I spoke to you at the beginning about all the different processes that have actually happened since Joshua died. I'm just going to go through them. I could spend probably 5 hours talking about all of these different processes. I'm not going to. I'm going to go through them really quickly. But as I'm going through this, just thinking, my belief is that had that single investigation been done properly at the time, how many of these processes wouldn't have been needed? So, there was an initial root cause analysis, and that really wasn't worth the paper it was written on. And if you read the Kirkland Report, that backs me up on that point. There was an internal investigation, and in many ways, this is one of the problems we had. The Trust were able to say, well, we got 2 external investigators in to look at Joshua's case. And this was part of the problem with the Ombudsman, because to them that looked like it was best practice. But if you look at how that was actually carried out, so the investigators, for example, weren't allowed to interview any of the staff involved in Joshua's care. So how could you have an external investigation that doesn't speak to any of the staff involved in what happened? And really that was a very inadequate process, and it left lots of questions. There was a supervisory investigation report, and I'll just give you a very quick example of the problems with this supervisory investigation report. So when we got this report, one of the things it said, I've told you that the medical records have gone missing, so the observation chart was gone, but my wife remembers one temperature, actually 2 temperatures, being on that observation chart, and the temperature she always remembered, and we wrote down at the time, was Joshua's temperature being 35.8 degrees. Okay, so she remembered that, we made a note of that. And when we got this investigation report, it said, basically the main finding was the records are gone, so we can't check, but all the midwives remember Joshua's temperatures were within a normal range between 36.4 and 36.8 degrees. Therefore, this is a system problem, not an individual problem. And of course, that at the time, when you know that's not the truth, just creates such a sense of distress and anger. And that's part of the reason, really, why I didn't want to give up on pushing these processes. So there was a review of the investigation, and that review said this is an exemplary report. It didn't support me at all. There was then a second review where I had to go to the NMC and get other people involved, and eventually they concluded that investigation report was flawed, so we got some acknowledgement, but they wouldn't go back and do it again properly, because at that time they argued that the issues were with the NMC. The Ombudsman looked at that investigation and they concluded we're not going to look at it, there's no evidence of maladministration. There was the fielding report that was done, that was hidden. And just think about the cost of all these processes, they just go on and on and on. There was the fielding report, there was the inquest where we did get some answers. And people, you know, don't really remember this, but at one point, Cumbria Police actually opened an investigation. At one point, there were 15 detectives working full-time on an investigation, criminal investigation into what happened at Furness General Hospital. Just some very brief reflections on that. My absolute belief is that you don't want to have police investigating healthcare failures. It's not a good thing. What this did was it created a big kind of block in the learning. Everything went into lockdown. Everything became ultra defensive. It stopped the organisation really from being able to learn as quickly as it could have done. So I don't want investigations, police investigations, and in the future I hope they are, but you know, they're not needed. Actually though, in terms of persuading the other organisations to go and look properly at what happened at Morecambe Bay, I don't believe that without the police investigation that would have happened. So I think it was key in this case to getting to the truth of what happened, but in the future I would not want to see, I wouldn't advocate for police investigations, and I think the approach we've got now with HSIB, the national investigations that they're able to do, it's a much better way of learning. So very briefly then, the Ombudsman didn't look at my complaints about the supervisory system. I appealed and the Ombudsman said we're not going to look at that. I then did the only thing you could do, which was called a judicial review, and I wrote what's called a letter before claim to the Ombudsman, and that made the Ombudsman look back again. And then they suddenly changed their mind and said, we will investigate this. And they looked at the supervisory investigation, they looked at the whole system, and in 2013 they published a report that fully upheld my complaint and actually recommended national changes to the midwifery supervision system. But you can see the route to getting that outcome was not an easy one. Grant Thornton report into CQC, so that cost £600,000, and it cost another £600,000, I think, because the people mentioned in the report all sued the CQC. So you can see the cost just going crazy. So okay, then there was the Morecambe Bay investigation, £2.5 million, 4 NMC hearings in 2016. This final investigation report that the Trust did in 2016, and the reflection is, if only they'd done that one first, how many of these other processes would have been needed? There was a final NMC hearing in 2017 that struck off the risk manager, who actually had retired years earlier anyway, so there wasn't much point in that. And then this wasn't the end. So after this, the Professional Standards Agency went back and they said, why did the NMC take 9-10 years to, well, yeah, 9 years to manage these cases? And they did a big investigation. And what they found was, that's been published, it's worth looking at. One of the key findings was that nurses and midwives have a duty to be open and honest, a duty of care to be open and honest when things go wrong. From our review, we don't believe that the NMC hold themselves to that standard. And there's been lots of changes at the NMC since then, and really positive changes, actually, I'm confident. But one of the things that led to this investigation was I'd asked the NMC to give me copies of all my personal data, because I wanted to find out, myself, why had they taken so long. And normally when you, as a trust, you'll get requests like this, and normally a Freedom of Information officer will collect the emails, they'll go through them, they'll redact any personal data, and they give them to people. But the NMC took about 6 months to do this. I couldn't understand why it was taking so long. There was delay after delay. And in the end, I got sent these CDs, and I couldn't believe it was from this top city, I won't mention the name of the law firm, but a top city law firm had done this. And I got these CDs with all my data, and I opened them. And there were some documents, for example, where there were 5 pages, and the only 2 words you could read were James Titcombe. Okay? So you're thinking, that's not really very helpful. So I asked the NMC, how much did you spend on this law firm making these redactions to my emails and my documents? And they told me, and I couldn't believe the answer. So the NMC, funded by midwives and nurses, okay, had spent, I'm not going to ask you to guess, I'm just going to show you, £250,000 on redacting my emails. And it's another example, isn't it, that organisations often do more harm to themselves when they're focusing on not, their reputation. and being open and transparent would have been so much better. So just very quickly then, along this whole journey, we had lots of help from the media, and one of the publications, Private Eye, wrote a lot about Joshua. And this is a column that was published in Private Eye in May 2013. And I'll just leave you to read it, because it highlights how kind of absurd it was. So it was crazy. There was a point in time when everybody was investigating somebody else and nobody was doing what they should have been doing, which was actually, why did Joshua die? Let's get to the bottom of this and let's be truthful about it. And along this journey as well, so we now know from the Kirkland Report that there were lethal failures that were happening in this unit. These are some of the things that we were told along this journey. So 2010, this was after a story in the local paper about Joshua. Around 12,000 babies are delivered safe and well at Furness General Hospital. Latest stats show that the hospital, the trust as a whole, are among the safest places in England to have a baby, with fewer stillbirths and neonatal deaths than the national average, right? So this is a unit that we now know was very, very dangerous. Yet the chief executive is standing up and saying, we're one of the safest hospitals in the country. And I'll talk about that just at the end of the slide. So another quote, our apologies can't lessen the pain and suffering of Joshua's parents, but we'd like to reassure the public that we've taken all steps we can to minimise the risk of this happening again. Tony Hansel. That was while he knew he had the fielding report and he hadn't shared it with anyone. What Bill Kirkland talked about is this mutual reassurance, everybody reassuring everybody else. I just want to talk quickly about statistics and about that first quote. So after that was published in the paper, I wrote to the hospital and I said, share with me the statistics that the chief exec is referring to. So they provided them. These are nationally published statistics. And sure enough, it seemed like there were very, very few neonatal deaths at Furness General Hospital. And in 2008, the statistics that were shared with me said there were 2 neonatal deaths. Now at that point, I just happened to know, through people I'd met, of 4 neonatal deaths at Furness General Hospital. So I went back, just by chance, through people I'd met, and I went back to the medical director and I said, look, you've said there's only 2, I know 4, these are the 4. And he wrote back to me and he said, yes, James, but Joshua didn't die at Furness General Hospital. He died at the Freeman Hospital. Chester Hendrickson didn't die at Furness General Hospital. He died at Preston Royal. Okay, so the message really is statistics can tell you anything. If you want to use statistics for reassurance, you can. It's pretty easy. What we should be using statistics for is inquiry, to be inquisitive, to look for opportunities to do better. So, persistent questioning and deep inquiry, important for learning. One of the great things that's changed in recent years is really as a direct result of these 2 people. So that's Dr. Carl McRae and Professor Charles Vincent. 2014, they wrote this paper. And the paper said, the NHS currently has no consistent approach to investigating and learning from safety issues. That resulted in the parliamentary PASC group, chaired by Bernard Jenkins, saying, actually, we need to think seriously about having an investigations capability, a national investigations capability in healthcare. An advisory group was put together that I was lucky enough to be part of, and now we do have HSIP, which I think is an absolutely fantastic thing. So HSIP is now able to do these investigations. I think if there was another Morecambe Bay, I think HSIP would be a really good organisation. A no-blame approach, it's not criminal. This is about what went wrong and why, not about individual blame. What do we need to do to learn? I mentioned I was part of the advisory group, and this advisory group made a number of recommendations. And there's a couple that I think are really important. So number 12, recommending a programme of capacity building improvement for safety investigation. And when I do these talks around the country, sometimes I ask people, and I won't do it now, but I ask the question, how many people in the room have been asked to do a serious incident investigation? And quite often, a lot of people put their hand up, maybe 90% of the people in the room. And if the next question is, how many of those people with their hands up have also had formal, high-quality training in how to do those investigations? And quite often there's hardly anybody with their hands left up. So how are we expecting people to do quite complex investigations, looking after families, supporting staff, if we're not training them? I think that's an area I'd like to see some change. And the other recommendation was a Just Culture Task Force be established. And I'm really pleased because there is a huge amount of work and talk and things being done to promote just culture at the moment. And years ago when I gave this presentation, I remember telling the chief executive of the CQC these two examples. So when I worked at Sellafield, the culture genuinely was very different to what I've experienced. And there's a couple of examples that I use. So one was on our site, 100 people working on a nuclear site. We had a kind of scheme where as long as there was 100 or more, either incident reports, but actually really what we were looking for was hazard observations, so things that had the potential to cause trouble, or cause a problem, cause a safety issue. 100 or more was reported a month. We'd pull one of them out of the hat, and whoever it was at random would get an iPad. Okay, and it's just to really reinforce that this is a positive thing to be doing. And another thing was, Human Performance Awards. So the example is I go to work, there'll be a poster on the wall, and it would say, this week's £25 Marks & Spencer's voucher goes to so-and-so. An example I remember was somebody carrying a scaffold pole, dropping the scaffold pole, smashing a load of insulation, causing thousands of pounds worth of damage. But because that person then reported that to his supervisor, that was the right thing to do. There's absolutely no blame, and in fact he gets a £25 Marks & Spencer voucher. And I think so much of culture is people observing what happens like that, what happens day to day, what happens when your colleague makes a mistake, what happens when your colleague's involved in a serious untoward incident report. If there are consequences and if that person's being blamed and it doesn't seem fair, that's going to result in a culture where people don't want to be open and honest. They don't want to, and that's what trust I think could learn from that kind of approach. You use DATEX here. Is datacism. So how many have heard that phrase? I'm not going to ask you actually. I'm sure the laughs of I'll datex you. Yes, I wrote about this. I think if you hear that phrase, I'll datex you, as a kind of a threat, what you're hearing is, look, we probably need to work on the culture a little bit more. So one little ask really is don't accept that phrase. It's not what incident reporting systems are for. So if we could change that, that would be really good. So really close to the end of the presentation now. At the beginning, I mentioned that date, 2004, as being an important date for the Kirkland Report. And this is a story that I hope kind of brings together everything I've been talking about. And it's a true story. I've told it so many times, I feel like I should apologise for telling it again. So if anyone's heard me saying this story before, I am sorry. But it's how I finish all the presentations. So it's the day of Joshua's funeral in 2008, and my wife says to me, it's a lovely sunny day in our little town, Dalton. Joshua's getting buried in the local cemetery, just very close to where we live. And my wife says to me, James, go and buy some flowers to put on the grave. And so I walk down to the local flower shop, beautiful sunny day, and I go in and I buy a big bunch of flowers, and I walk up to the lady in the flower shop, who up until that point was probably having a really nice morning. And she said to me, I hope they're for somebody special. And I poured my heart out to this poor lady who was just having a nice day. And I told her, that actually it's the day I'm burying my son. I told her what had happened. And this poor lady burst into tears, absolutely crying her eyes out. And I thought, oh, what have I done? And she said to me, don't worry, the reason why I'm so upset, the reason why I'm crying is because in 2004, I lost a baby girl at Furness General Hospital. I'll never forget what she said. She said to me, but in my case, it was just one of those things. It was nothing like you've described. It was just one of those things. There's nothing anybody could have done differently. Okay. So I stayed in touch with that lady. And remember I told you that in 2011, Cumbria Police started a big investigation. One of the things Cumbria Police found was a letter. I've actually got the letter here. It's on the screen. And the letter is dated the 11th of October 2008. And the letter is from a consultant, and he's very angry because 3 weeks earlier, a baby called Alex Brady had died. And what happened in Alex's case is they were having problems in the second stage of labour, they couldn't find the heart rate, there were all kinds of issues. And an obstetrician had tried to come into the room, and the midwife put a foot in front of the door, said, we don't need you, you're not needed. And Alex died in the second stage of labour, the cord round the neck, and Alex died. And this is a really angry letter, and this is the key kind of paragraph from it. So the doctor says, my main concern, we're trying to make every labour and delivery as normal and natural as possible, not thinking about the complications. Obviously the baby has died sometime in the second stage. It's not possible for the baby to die within 5 minutes because of shoulder dystocia. I don't think we can defend in a court of law when you've not heard the fetal heart with the Doppler and explaining it's normal but we can't pick it up. And this is the crucial line. So I'm all for